Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere peculiar. Somewhere that feels both strangely familiar and yet utterly alien. Picture a small village in medieval France just as the morning mist begins to burn off the thatched roofs. There's a chill in the air that has nothing to do with the weather. In the center of the muddy town square, a crowd is gathering, their voices a low, somber murmur. They aren't here for a market or a festival. They're here for a trial. And the defendant currently held in a sturdy wooden pen is a pig. Yes, a pig. And frankly, considering the complete absence of modern sanitation and the fact that a simple infection could be a death sentence, you probably wouldn't survive your first week here, let alone long enough to see if the pig gets convicted. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always a huge encouragement. For those of you already settled in, I'd love to see where and when you're listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always amazing to see this little community stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gentle whir of the fan fades, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the village. You can feel the rough weave of a simple woolen tunic against your skin and the cold that seeps up from the ground through your thin leather shoes. You are standing on the edge of that crowd, peering between a farmer with suspicion in his eyes and a baker dusting flour from his apron. This isn't a joke. This is justice. Or at least what passed for it in a world where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was perilously thin. Welcome to the world of medieval animal trials. For over 500 years, from the 13th to the 18th century, it was a documented and surprisingly formal legal practice in many parts of Europe to formally prosecute animals. We have records of hundreds of these cases. Pigs, rats, dogs, horses, and even swarms of insects were issued summons, arrested, held in custody, tried in a court of law, and, if found guilty, sentenced. It sounds like something from a surrealist painting, but it was an accepted part of the legal landscape. You have to wrap your head around a fundamentally different worldview. To the medieval mind, the universe was a great moral stage, and every creature had a role to play assigned by God. If an animal violently stepped out of its role, if a pig harmed a child, or if a plague of locusts devoured a crop, it wasn't just an unfortunate event. It was a disruption of the divine order, a crime. And the only way to restore that order was through the solemn, ritualistic process of the law. It's tempting to imagine your modern-day Chihuahua, Princess Fluffy, but on the stand for shredding a pillow, complete with a tiny powdered wig. And while they didn't have wigs, they did occasionally provide the accused animal with a lawyer. The entire process was designed to mirror human justice as closely as possible, which is where things get truly fascinating. The pig you're watching, for instance, isn't just being held in any old pen. If it has been formally charged, it's likely being kept in the local jail at the public's expense. That's our first quirky little tidbit for the night. Accused animals were often given the same prison rations as human inmates while they awaited their day in court. You can just imagine the disgruntled muttering of a human prisoner as the guard walks past his cell with a bucket of slop specifically earmarked for the felonious swine next door. The pig was probably eating better than half the peasants who came to watch its trial, but what exactly is going on in the minds of the people here? That's where the real mystery lies. Historians still argue whether these trials were taken with complete, solemn seriousness by everyone involved, or if there was an element of ritualistic theater designed to reassure a frightened populace. Was the priest who was about to testify genuinely convinced of the pig's moral culpability? Or did he understand on some level that this was a performance meant to give a community a sense of control in a world filled with chaos, disease, and random misfortune? When a child was harmed, perhaps prosecuting the animal was a way to process communal grief and anger, to find a focal point for their horror that was less terrifying than the idea that tragedy can simply strike for no reason at all. The crowd shifts, and you get a better view. You see the bailiff, a man whose importance is slightly undermined by a prominent food stain on his tunic, clearing a path. A local magistrate, looking profoundly bored and perhaps a little hungover, takes his seat on a raised platform. This isn't some backwater kangaroo court. This is the system at work. It's slow, it's bureaucratic, and it's deadly serious. Forget streaming services in reality television. For a medieval villager, a public trial like this was a major event. It's a civics lesson, a horror story, and a town meeting all rolled into one. And as the pig gives a soft, indifferent oink from its pen, you realize you're about to witness the full, bewildering force of a legal system that saw no meaningful difference between a man who steals a loaf of bread and a beast that commits a crime. The only question was which court had the proper authority to hear the case, a matter of considerable and confusing debate, which would determine the animal's ultimate fate. So as you stand there, trying to discreetly keep your distance from a man whose personal aroma suggests a deep-seated grudge against soap and water, a question bubbles up in your mind. What kind of court even handles this? It's a pig. You can't exactly send it to small claims court. The answer, like most things in the medieval period, is both complicated and utterly, stubbornly logical within its own framework. You see, you've stumbled upon the fundamental division in animal justice, the great schism between the secular courts and the ecclesiastical courts. Two different systems for two different kinds of non-human crime. The scene unfolding before you, with the magistrate and the bailiff and the pig in its pen, falls under the purview of the secular or civil court. This was the domain of lords, magistrates, and kings. These courts handled individual animals, usually larger domestic ones, pigs, oxen, horses, dogs, that had committed a direct, tangible crime against a person or property. They were tried for murder, assault, or serious damages. This wasn't about symbolism, it was about blood. The charge against this pig is almost certainly that it harmed, or perhaps even killed, a human being, likely a child. In the eyes of this court, the pig acted with malice. It is a criminal, an individual felon, and it will be tried as such. The process would be a startling echo of a human trial. The bailiff, our friend with the stained tunic, would have been the one to formally arrest the pig, perhaps after gathering witness statements from your neighbors. One imagines him trying to maintain his dignity while reading the pig its rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you own can and will be used against you in a court of law. But then there was the other system, the ecclesiastical court run by the church. This court dealt with a completely different class of defendant. They weren't concerned with a single sow, but with 1,000 sinners. The church courts handled collective entities, the swarms and plagues that threatened a community's livelihood. Think rats, locusts, caterpillars, weevils, snakes, eels, any small, numerous creature that appeared in destructive numbers. You couldn't put 1,000,000 grasshoppers in a jail cell. The secular court's methods were useless here. These creatures weren't seen as individual felons, but as a divine scourge, an instrument of God's wrath sent to punish a community for its sins. Therefore, only the spiritual authority of the church could handle them. Let's step away from the tin square for a moment. Picture yourself in a nearby vineyard. The leaves are skeletal, chewed to lace by 1,000,000 tiny green caterpillars. The harvest is ruined. Your family might starve this winter. You don't need a bailiff, you need an exorcist. This is where the ecclesiastical court would step in. The process here wasn't a criminal trial, but more like a supernatural lawsuit. The community, through its priest, would file a formal complaint. And this leads to one of the most wonderfully bizarre practices of the era, the formal summons. A court official, a notary from the local diocese, would be dispatched to the afflicted area. There, standing before the blighted vines, he would unroll a scroll and, in a loud, clear voice, read out a legal injunction, ordering the caterpillars to cease their destruction and appear before the bishop's court on a specified date to answer for their crimes. He had to do this 3 times. You have to appreciate the sheer, unblinking formality of a man in robes shouting legal threats at insects, probably trying very hard not to get any in his mouth. Scholars continue to debate whether the distinction between these two court systems was purely practical. You can hang one pig, but not 1,000,000 caterpillars, or if it reflected a deeper theological divide. The secular trial treated the animal as the agent of the crime. The ecclesiastical trial, however, often treated the people as the true sinners. The plague of vermin was merely their punishment, and the trial was an elaborate, public ritual of repentance. It was a chance for the community to purify itself, to prove its piety, and to persuade God to call off his six-legged army. The failure of the weevils to appear in court, which was meticulously recorded by a church scribe, wasn't just noted. It was seen as an act of contempt against God's own justice, which only strengthened the church's case against them. You have to wonder if this contempt of court charge would follow the weevils into the afterlife, perhaps affecting their karma or their credit score for future reincarnations. So, you have two paths of justice. One leads to a hangman's noose, the other leads to a bishop's curse. One is about punishing a body, the other is about cleansing a soul, the soul of the community. Back in the square, the pig gives another lazy snort, blissfully unaware of the legal theory swirling around it. There's no doubt which court it belongs in. The blood is on its snout, so to speak. This is a secular matter, a criminal case. The full weight of human law is about to be brought down on this single, solitary animal. And as the magistrate shuffles his papers and clears his throat, you sense that the preliminaries are over. The story of what this particular pig actually did is about to be told. The magistrate's voice, surprisingly reedy for such a stout man, cuts through the low hum of the crowd. The generalities you've just been pondering of church courts and secular laws evaporate like mist. This is no longer a theoretical exercise. The story of this particular pig, the reason for this gathering on this chilly morning, begins to unfold. And you learn that this isn't just any pig. This is the sow from the nearby town of Falaise, and this is the year of our Lord, 1386. Her crime, as laid out by the court, is the most awful imaginable. The sow is charged with having viciously attacked the infant son of a carpenter named Jean Lameau. The official record states in the dispassionate language of bureaucracy that the pig did mangle and murder in its face and arms the 3-month-old child. The baby, left unattended for only a few moments in its cradle, was so grievously wounded by the animal that he did not survive. Try to imagine the scene not as a bizarre historical footnote, but as a moment of pure, visceral horror for the people involved. A small, drafty peasant home. The smell of wood smoke, straw, and simmering pottage. The ordinary sounds of a village afternoon, shattered by a scream. Pigs in this era were not the clean, pink creatures of storybooks. They were tough, semi-wild scavengers that roamed the muddy streets, and everyone knew they could be dangerous. But this was different. This wasn't an accident. In the eyes of the community, this was an act of profound evil. A transgression against the natural order. The pig didn't have much of an alibi. It was found near the scene, and let's just say the evidence on its snout was compelling. It wasn't exactly a master of the clean getaway. The wheels of secular justice, which could grind so slowly for humans, moved with terrifying speed. The sow was identified, seized by the local authorities, and formally charged. Her owner was not held responsible. The law at the time often viewed the animal itself as the sole perpetrator. The sow was then transferred to the castle jail to await her trial, her upkeep meticulously recorded in the town's expense ledger. 9 sous and 9 deniers for the care and feeding of one homicidal pig. But this is where the story takes an even stranger turn, a perfect little tidbit of legal absurdity. The sow had a litter of piglets. And in the initial uproar, they too were arrested and implicated in the crime, charged as accomplices. You have to picture the bailiff, having just wrangled a furious, full-grown sow, being told to go back and round up her 6 squirming, squealing children as well. The entire family was held in custody. Ultimately, however, the piglets were acquitted. After due consideration, the court concluded that there was no proof they had partaken in the gruesome act. The official verdict cited their youth and the bad example set by their mother as reasons for their release. Their lawyer must have made a compelling too young and innocent to form criminal intent argument, a defense which, to be fair, still has its moments in modern courtrooms. Even as this small mercy was being shown, the case against the mother was absolute. Historians and legal scholars still debate what these medieval communities truly believed about the animal's intent in a case like this. Did they genuinely believe the pig was a vessel for a demonic spirit, as was sometimes argued in similar trials? Was it possessed? Or was this a more straightforward, almost mechanical application of the ancient legal principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a life for a life? The agent of death, be it man or beast, must itself be destroyed to restore balance to the universe and to God's ordered world. In the face of the unimaginable grief of the Lumo family, perhaps the community found comfort not in understanding the why, but in the rigid certainty of the how. How to respond. How to make things right again. The human tragedy of Jean Lumo, the tiny infant, is the quiet, aching heart of this whole spectacle. Without that loss, there is no trial, no crowd, no bizarre entry in a ledger. The entire proceeding is a desperate attempt to impose meaning and order onto a senseless, heartbreaking event. The magistrate knows this. The priest knows this. And every person standing here in the cold knows this. This isn't just about punishing an animal. It's about healing the wound it tore in the fabric of their community. The magistrate shuffles his papers, the crinkle of the parchment loud in the relative quiet. He's heard the testimony. He's reviewed the evidence. The pig has been imprisoned and fed. Her children have been questioned and released. Every box has been ticked. He has to get this right. The whole town is watching, and frankly, he probably wants to get it all sorted before the midday meal. The facts of the case are no longer in question. All that remains is the performance of justice, the public spectacle that will bring this terrible chapter to its grim, formal conclusion. The magistrate gives a sharp, decisive nod to the bailiff. The time for presenting the facts is over. Now the somber theater of the law itself must play out. You shuffle forward with the crowd, finding a place on a rough-hewn bench that has been set up for the public. This is your seat for the main event. The courtroom is nothing more than this patch of flattened earth in the castle courtyard, open to the gray, unforgiving sky. A sturdy table serves as the judge's bench, and in the center of it all, standing as the undeniable focal point, is the defendant's pen. The proceedings begin in earnest, and what strikes you is the sheer, dogged formality of it all. This is not a mob crying for blood. This is a system, however strange, following its own rules. As established by legal tradition, witnesses are called to testify under oath. You watch as the child's grieving father steps forward, his voice thick with sorrow as he recounts the terrible discovery. A neighbor follows, describing the sounds she heard. Their words paint a grim, unshakable picture of the event. The evidence is presented. The charges are read aloud again for all to hear. It is a meticulous pantomime of human justice. And then comes the most surreal part. To ensure the trial is legally sound, the court has appointed a lawyer for the pig. A procureur, a man of the law, is tasked with the unenviable job of mounting a defense. You can see him now, a man in slightly better robes than the rest, looking deeply uncomfortable. He can't exactly claim his client has an alibi, or was in another town when the crime occurred. And the whole concept of cross-examination falls apart when your client's primary modes of communication are oinking and snuffling. The challenges, you must admit, are significant as so what could he possibly argue? This is a wonderful little fringe area of legal history. In cases like this, a common defense was to argue from theology. The lawyer might contend that an animal, lacking a God-given soul and the capacity for moral reason, cannot be held culpable for its actions in the same way a human can. It acts on base instinct, not on calculated malice. It is, in the eyes of God, an innocent, and therefore cannot be guilty of a crime. He might argue that the pig was merely an instrument, like a falling rock or a bolt of lightning, a tragic force of nature, but not a criminal. It's a surprisingly sophisticated argument, one that delves deep into the philosophical questions of free will and sin. Historians have long debated how seriously these legal advocates took their roles. Was this lawyer just going through the motions, a procedural cog in the machine of justice, ensuring that all the paperwork was in order before the inevitable guilty verdict? Or did he, and others like him, genuinely relish the intellectual gymnastics required? Did he spend the night before poring over texts by Augustine and Aquinas, looking for a loophole, for that one perfect, unassailable argument that would exonerate a pig? The very existence of celebrated animal lawyers, whom we shall meet later in our journey, suggests that for some, this was no joke. It was the ultimate legal challenge. The defendant, for its part, seems entirely unconcerned by the eloquent arguments being made in its name. It nudges a loose stone with its snout, then lets out a grunt of profound indifference. The pig hasn't shown the slightest hint of remorse, mostly because its brain is entirely occupied with the timeless and noble pursuits of mud, naps, and the possibility of a stray turnip. The contrast between the high-minded legal drama of the humans and the pig's simple, earthy reality is almost dizzying. The defense, however valiant, is ultimately futile. The crime was too public, the tragedy too raw. The magistrate listens patiently, then confers with the local aldermen who act as his jury. The verdict is swift: guilty. The magistrate stands, and in a loud voice that echoes slightly off the castle walls, he pronounces the sentence. The sow is condemned to be mutilated in the leg and head, mirroring the infant's injuries, and then to be hanged by its hind legs from a wooden gibbet until dead. They were always very particular about the method. It couldn't just be a simple execution. It had to have a certain judicial flair, a symbolic resonance that the whole community could witness and understand. The sentence hangs in the air. The crowd is silent, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and somber awe. The bailiff and his assistants begin to move toward the pen. The final act is about to be carried out. But as you watch them, a thought drifts into your mind. This works in a grim way for a single pig. But what happens when the defendant isn't one animal you can lead to the gallows? What happens when the criminals number in the thousands or millions? What do you do when an entire army of insects lays siege to your town? You can't hang a swarm of locusts. For that, you need a different kind of justice entirely. The grim finality of the pig's sentence begins to dissolve in your mind, the scene in the castle courtyard fading like a watercolor left in the rain. In its place, a new landscape emerges, warmer and brighter, yet charged with a different kind of despair. You are no longer surrounded by damp stone and the smell of the city. You are standing at the edge of a rolling vineyard, somewhere in the sun-drenched hills of Burgundy. The air is sweet with the scent of warm earth and crushed leaves, but underneath it all is a quiet, persistent, unnerving hum. A sound of methodical destruction before you. The grapevines are a portrait of ruin. The leaves are not merely wilted. They are shredded, chewed down to their skeletal veins. The nascent, precious grapes have been devoured. This wasn't a swift, violent crime like the one in Falaise. This was a slow-motion catastrophe, a siege laid by an innumerable, implacable army. Your defendants in this case are weevils, or beetles, or caterpillars. It hardly matters. They are legion, and they are eating the entire village's future, one bite at a time. This is the doorway into the world of the ecclesiastical court. These trials against vermin were a surprisingly common occurrence, especially in the agricultural heartlands of France, Italy, and Switzerland, with cases recorded from the 12th century well into the 17th. There was the famous case against the Spanish fly beetles who had taken over the territory of Coire, Switzerland, and the well-documented proceedings against the weevils of St. Julien, a case so complex it dragged on for decades. When a community faced this kind of creeping agricultural doom, they didn't call for the bailiff. They went to the priest. Imagine the farmers, having exhausted every practical remedy they knew. They had likely tried everything from picking the bugs off by hand, to shouting various insults at them, to maybe even leaving a series of scathing one-star reviews on the nearest leaf. When all that failed, when their own efforts proved useless against the sheer scale of the infestation, they turned to the law. They would draft a formal petition to the local bishop, detailing their plight and humbly requesting that the church intervene on their behalf. The theological logic here, as we touched on, is flipped on its head. The weevils are not just hungry bugs. They are a sign, a divine chastisement for the sins of the parish. Therefore, the legal process that is about to unfold is not just aimed at the insects. It's also aimed at the people. Before the church will agree to curse the bugs, the villagers must first prove their own piety. They might be ordered to participate in special processions around the afflicted fields, to say extra prayers, or, much to their dismay, to make sure their tithes were fully paid up. It was a spiritual shakedown. First, you get right with God. Then he'll consider calling off his six-legged messengers. This process was wrapped in the same love of bureaucracy as the secular courts. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Before a trial could even begin, the bishop would often appoint an exploratory commission. 2 or 3 respected men of the parish would be sent out to the fields as official investigators, tasked with viewing the damage firsthand and submitting a formal report to the court. You can just picture these two fellows, perhaps the local baker and a cooper, standing among the ruined vines, stroking their chins and looking serious. Their subsequent report would be a masterpiece of understatement. After extensive on-site investigation, we have concluded that the little green things are, in fact, eating the big green things. The situation is, to use the correct legal term, not good. Historians and sociologists argue about the precise mindset of the villagers themselves during these proceedings. Did they truly believe the weevils would pack their tiny bags and leave if a judge told them to? Or was this a highly structured, ritualized form of mass prayer? The answer is likely somewhere in between. It was a way of actively participating in their own salvation. In a world where you are otherwise helpless, the trial offered a script. It turned passive victims of a natural disaster into active plaintiffs in a cosmic lawsuit. It gave them a sense of control, a series of steps to follow, a narrative that could, with God's help, lead to a happy ending. Of course, the weevils themselves remained stubbornly unimpressed by the looming threat of litigation. They had not retained counsel. They had not prepared a defense. They continued their single-minded rampage, entirely focused on their simple 2-point agenda. 1. Eat the vineyard. 2. Make more weevils. Their silent, industrious contempt for human legal procedure was in its own way absolute, and so, with the villagers' petition accepted and the damage formally assessed by the commission, the ecclesiastical court is ready to make its first move. The first step is not a curse. The law, even God's law, must follow procedure. It must be fair. The defendants, however numerous and disgusting, must be given a chance to repent. And so a man unrolls a fresh sheet of parchment, dips his quill in ink, and begins to draft the first official warning. The show is about to begin. The parchment is ready. The ink is dark. And the first step in this celestial lawsuit is about to be taken. It doesn't begin with fire and brimstone. The Church, in its ancient and methodical wisdom, understood the importance of due process. Even for a caterpillar. The first move is a gentle one, a paternal warning known as a monitoire. You watch as the local priest, looking slightly out of place in his formal vestments, walks with a solemn procession of villagers to the edge of the blighted fields. He stands before the ruined vines, takes a deep breath, and begins to speak. Not to the people, but to the insects. His voice rings out, formal and clear, addressing the unclean beasts and creeping things. He admonishes them for their gluttony, reminding them that the earth and its fruits were made by God for the sustenance of man, not for their ruin. He exhorts them, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to depart from this parish, to cease their destruction, and to trouble the good Christian folk no more. He gives them a deadline. 3 days to pack up and leave. Then he makes the sign of the cross over the fields, and the first warning is complete. This careful, 3-step escalation was a core principle of ecclesiastical justice. It had to be followed to the letter for the final verdict to have any spiritual weight. Step 1 was this fatherly warning. When that inevitably failed, because the weevils were, as a rule, unmoved by stern pastoral advice, the court moved to step 2, the formal summons. Another official would be dispatched. This time, he would read a legal document commanding the pests to appear before the bishop's court on a given day. There, they would face the charges against them and be given an opportunity to present a defense. The court, in its infinite fairness and love of procedure, was even willing to provide them with legal counsel. One assumes it was a pro bono case, as the defendants were notoriously short on cash and tangible assets. This is where we find another one of history's most delightful and quirky rabbit holes. Since the insects, rats, or other vermin invariably failed to show up for their court date, the summons having been ignored, the court couldn't simply declare them guilty. That would be a mistrial. To ensure justice was served fairly, the judge would officially appoint a lawyer, a procureur, to represent the absent defendants. This was a real, often highly respected lawyer tasked with the solemn duty of defending a swarm of flies. He was expected to make genuine arguments on their behalf. He might argue that his clients were, in fact, also creatures of God, and that they were simply exercising their God-given right to eat. He might argue that the fields they occupied were theirs long before the villagers planted their crops. His job was to be the voice for the voiceless, even if the voiceless were a writhing mass of caterpillars. When all these legal niceties were observed, when the warnings were ignored and the defense arguments were heard and overruled, only then could the court proceed to the final, terrifying step. Step 3. The anathema. The curse. The formal excommunication. This was the church's nuclear option, the equivalent of being unfriended, blocked, and reported to the celestial authorities all at once. It was a moment of high ritual and intense public drama. Imagine the entire village gathered before the church. The bishop himself, in his full, imposing regalia, stands on the steps. In one hand he holds a bell, in the other a lit candle. He begins the ritual, his voice booming across the square as he recounts the crimes of the vermin, their stubbornness, their contempt for God's law. He pronounces them excommunicate, anathema. He casts them out from the community of God's creation, revokes their right to exist on consecrated land, and condemns them to wither and perish. Then comes the final, dramatic flourish. As he speaks the last word of the curse, he violently rings the bell, a sound of discord and damnation. He slams his holy book shut, and he inverts the candle, extinguishing its flame in a bucket of water or into the earth itself, symbolizing the snuffing out of the creature's light and hope. Scholars debate the psychological impact of this ritual on the community. Was it primarily a theological act, a genuine magical attempt to banish the pests and the demonic forces behind them? Or was it a form of communal catharsis? A way for a powerless and frustrated populace to channel all their fear and anger into a single, powerful, religiously sanctioned moment of release. Perhaps by damning the insects, they were cleansing themselves, restoring a sense of order and control, even if the bugs themselves didn't notice. The weevils, having been officially damned to heck, likely just carried on with lunch, their tiny, godless hearts entirely unmoved by the bishop's dramatic performance. Still, the system demanded it. And the system demanded a defense lawyer. It makes you wonder, what kind of man takes that job? What sort of brilliant, and perhaps deeply eccentric, legal mind decides to make his name by standing up in a bishop's court and earnestly arguing on behalf of a plague of rats? As it happens, history has the perfect example of just such a man. The man's name was Barthélemy de Chasseneuze, or as he's more comfortably known to history, Bartholomew Chasseneuze. And he was, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest animal lawyer of the 16th century. To call him an animal rights activist would be to miss the point entirely. He was something far more interesting. He was a man who believed in the system in all its majestic absurdity, and he insisted that its rules be followed to the letter, for every defendant, whether they walked on 2 legs or 100. That you can picture him now, not as some wild-eyed eccentric, but as a serious, formidable French jurist born in 1480. He was a man of the Renaissance, a product of an age of burgeoning intellectual curiosity, and he was brilliant. This wasn't some fringe character operating in a dusty provincial court. Chasseneuze was a legal giant of his day, a respected scholar who would eventually rise to the very high office of President of the Parliament of Provence. His work was cited by other jurists for centuries. He was, in every sense of the word, part of the establishment. And what did this great legal mind choose to write about in his youth? What topic captured his formidable intellect? While other ambitious lawyers were writing dry, predictable tracts on inheritance law or maritime disputes, Chasseneuze was tackling the big questions. Questions like, What is the proper and legally binding way to serve a subpoena to a field of grasshoppers? In the early 1500s, he published his masterpiece on the subject, the Concilium Primum, De Processu contra Animalia, a comprehensive legal treatise on the correct procedures for prosecuting animals. He didn't just participate in these trials. He literally wrote the book on them, compiling historical precedents, analyzing scripture, and laying out the precise step-by-step process for bringing a lawsuit against vermin. He was a man who loved the law, its traditions, its loopholes, its magnificent, sprawling complexity. And his book is a testament to this passion. In it, we find all sorts of wonderfully quirky legal arguments. For instance, he laid out a foundational principle that the curse of excommunication must be highly specific. A priest could not, he argued, simply curse the caterpillars. That was too broad. The curse had to be directed only at the specific caterpillars currently devastating a particular parish. Why? Because, he reasoned, just as one man cannot be held responsible for the sins of all mankind, the caterpillars of Burgundy could not be held liable for the crimes of their cousins in Champagne. He was essentially arguing for legal jurisdiction. My clients, the beetles of Village A, deny all association with the well-known hooliganism of the beetles in Village B. We are the respectable beetles. Of course, this raises the question of what Chassenny himself truly believed. Legal historians still debate the true nature of his work. Was he a profoundly sincere believer, a devout man who felt that God's justice demanded even the lowliest creature receive a fair trial? Or was he a master satirist, a man with a razor-sharp wit who saw the inherent absurdity in these trials and used them as a way to subtly poke fun at the logical contortions of the legal system itself? Perhaps he saw these cases as the ultimate intellectual exercise, a kind of legal whetstone upon which to sharpen his skills and showcase his encyclopedic knowledge of civil and canon law. There may not be a single answer. He was likely a complex mixture of all these things. A man of sincere faith, a lover of legal puzzles, and someone with a highly developed sense of the absurd. It was also most likely a brilliant career move. As a young lawyer trying to make a name for himself, taking on these bizarre, high-profile cases was a fantastic way to get noticed. They were the talk of the town. If you could demonstrate your brilliance by crafting a defense for a defendant who couldn't speak and refused to show up to court, you were clearly a man of formidable talent. After all, if you can successfully argue for a continuance in the trial of 1,000 rats, handling a simple human tax appeal must feel like a refreshing holiday. So we have our protagonist, a man of deep intellect, of soaring ambition, and of a peculiar, highly specific expertise. A man who looked at a plague of rats not as a problem of sanitation, but as a fascinating procedural challenge. His genius was not in trying to tear down the system, but in mastering its labyrinthine rules so completely that he could use the system itself to his own advantage. And some of the defenses he constructed were nothing short of masterpieces of procedural mischief and legal cunning. So how did he do it? How did Bartholomew Chassenny, a respected man of letters, stand before a court of grim-faced bishops and argue for the rights of a rat? He did it not by challenging the law, but by embracing it more fervently than anyone else in the room. He weaponized procedure. He understood that the Church's power in these trials was rooted in its claim to a higher, more perfect form of justice. Chassenny's entire strategy was simply to hold them to that impossible standard. His primary tactic was delay. He knew he could never win a case on the merits. He wasn't going to convince a judge that the locusts were innocent of eating the crops. But he could postpone the trial again and again by finding tiny procedural flaws. He hoped that if he could delay long enough, the problem might solve itself, the seasons would change, the pests would move on, and the parish, having forgotten its initial fury, would quietly drop the case. His arguments were masterpieces of legal pedantry, designed to tie the cord in knots. His most famous line of attack concerned the summons itself. As you'll recall, a court official would go to the fields and read out a proclamation ordering the pests to appear in court. Chassenny would rise to his feet and object. He would argue that while the proclamation was indeed read, the court had no proof that every single defendant had heard it. How could they be sure that the message had reached the weevils at the far end of the field, or the ones still in their larval stage? He argued that a collective summons was legally insufficient. For the trial to be just, every last creature had to be individually notified. It was the 16th century equivalent of arguing that the summons went to their spam folder. A brilliant, infuriating, and completely unprovable defense. If that failed, he had other arrows in his quiver. He would argue for a change of venue, claiming his clients could not possibly get a fair hearing. The court, after all, was run by their mortal enemies, the very humans whose crops they were accused of eating. The whole system was biased against them. He would then pivot to one of his most audacious and celebrated arguments, an argument so clever it has echoed through legal history. He claimed that even if his clients wanted to obey the summons and appear in court, they could not do so safely. This is the quirky tidbit to end all quirky tidbits. In one legendary case, which we'll explore fully in a moment, he was defending a town's rats. He stood before the court and argued that his clients, the rats, were of a timid and fearful disposition. For them to travel from their homes all the way to the courthouse would require them to cross open ground, exposing them to mortal peril from their sworn enemies, the town's cats. The cats, he pointedly noted, were owned by the plaintiffs themselves. He argued that the court had a constitutional duty to guarantee his clients safe passage. Therefore, he demanded that the court order the plaintiffs to restrain every single one of their cats on pain of a heavy fine, so that his clients could attend the trial without fear of being ambushed and eaten. The sheer, glorious audacity is just breathtaking. Legal scholars still debate the deep meaning behind these tactics. Was Chassagne making a sincere, groundbreaking argument for the legal rights of animals, the right to proper notice, the right to a fair trial, the right to be protected from harm? Or was he engaging in a form of masterful satire, a kind of legal trolling where he used the court's own absurd premises to expose its limitations? By demanding the town lock up its cats, he was forcing the judges to confront the practical impossibility of their own legal fiction. You can just imagine the scene. The exasperated bishop, rubbing his temples as he listens to a passionate, 10-minute oration on the mortal terror a rat feels when it sees a tabby. Chassagne would cite legal precedents, quote scripture, and maintain a look of absolute, unwavering seriousness the entire time. The judges couldn't just dismiss him because his arguments, within the bizarro logic of the court, were technically valid. He had them completely and utterly trapped by their own rules, and beneath the humor, he would weave in genuinely complex theological points. He'd cite the book of Genesis, where God gives humanity dominion over the animals. But Chassagne would add, God also gives the animals the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Therefore, he would argue, his clients were not acting out of malice. They were acting in obedience to a direct commandment from God. Who were they, humble creatures of the field, to disobey the Almighty's first and most direct order to their kind? These were not just theoretical arguments he recorded in a book for the amusement of other lawyers. Chassagne put these very defenses into practice in what would become the most famous and well-documented animal trial of his entire career. It was a case that involved all his greatest hits: the flawed summons, the terrified defendants, and of course the cats. It was the Great Rat Trial of Autun. The story has become a legend among lawyers and historians, a perfect crystalline example of a system pushed to its logical extreme. It begins, as these tales so often do, with a ruined harvest and a town full of desperate people. The year is thought to be 1522, and the French provincial town of Autun has a rat problem. Not just a few rats in the cellar, but a biblical plague of them, a swarming, squeaking horde that has descended upon the region's precious barley fields, threatening the entire community with famine. Having exhausted all other remedies, the citizens of Autun do what any sensible, God-fearing 16th century community would do: they sue the rats. A formal complaint is lodged with the ecclesiastical court of the diocese. The rats of Autun and the surrounding countryside are officially charged with felonious theft and the wanton destruction of the barley crop. The court, following its solemn procedure, issues a summons, ordering the rodent defendants to appear on a set day and answer for their crimes. Predictably, the court date arrives and the defendant's dock is empty. Not a single rat appears. The prosecutor for the townspeople stands and demands that the rats be found guilty by default. But the judge, a man who clearly valued due process, refused. Instead, he appointed a lawyer to represent the absent rats. And the man he appointed was none other than the brilliant, ambitious, and already renowned Bartholomew Chassani. Chassani rises to his feet, and the show begins. His first move is to challenge the validity of the summons. With a serious expression, he argues that his clients had not been properly notified. He explains that the rats of the diocese are a diverse and widespread population. They live in many different villages, in countless barns, cellars, granaries, and holes in the ground. A single public proclamation in the town of Autun, he argues, was hardly sufficient to reach all of them. He contends that for the summons to be legally binding, the court must ensure it is announced from the pulpit of every single parish his clients inhabit. He was essentially demanding the court embark on a grand tour of every damp basement and dusty attic in the region, personally delivering tiny invitations. The court, stunned by the logic and wanting to be seen as unimpeachably fair, conceded the point. They ordered a second, more thorough, summons to be issued across the entire region. A new court date is set. The priests of the diocese dutifully read the summons to their congregations, both human and presumably rodent. And yet again the day arrives and the rats fail to appear. The prosecutor, now visibly furious, stands and demands an end to the farce. He insists the court issue its final judgment and curse the creatures to perdition. But Chassani, calm and composed, rises to speak once more. This is the moment he unleashes his masterpiece. He begins by acknowledging the court's diligence in issuing the second summons. However, he explains to the judge, the problem was not one of notification, but of transportation. His clients, he says with a voice full of sincere sympathy, are respectable, law-abiding rodents who were fully prepared to attend the hearing. But, alas, they could not. The journey to the courthouse, he explains, was fraught with mortal danger. He speaks of the wily and murderous cats kept by the plaintiffs themselves, which lurk around every corner, just waiting to ambush his innocent clients. You have to picture him, with a perfectly straight face, describing the sheer terror of his poor, furry defendants being unable to leave their homes for fear of being torn to shreds by a certain Mrs. Higgins's notoriously bloodthirsty tabby. He concludes by arguing that the court has a sacred duty to protect defendants on their way to justice. Therefore, the trial cannot proceed until the plaintiffs, the townspeople, restrain every one of their cats under a bond, guaranteeing the safe passage of every rat to the courthouse. The court was paralyzed. The argument was absurd, yet, within the framework of their own legal system, it was technically sound. A defendant had a right to appear. If the plaintiff actively prevented that appearance, even through their pets, the defendant could not be held in contempt. Did the court have the authority to order the entire town to lock up its cats? The case was thrown into chaos, and in the end it was indefinitely postponed. Chassani had won. The rats of Autun were never convicted. The rats, for their part, never sent a thank you note or paid his legal fees, which is a feeling many lawyers throughout history can probably relate to. The Great Rat Trial of Autun is often cited in the debate over the very purpose of these proceedings. Was this the moment the system broke, collapsing under the weight of its own internal logic? Or was it, in a strange way, the system's finest hour? Chassani forced the court to choose between practical reality and procedural purity. And the court, faced with an impossible choice, chose to stall rather than render a verdict it knew to be procedurally flawed. While Chassani was winning these bizarre victories of procedure in the church courts, a much grimmer and more final form of justice was being meted out every day in the secular courts. For while the rats of Autun got off on a technicality, the pig of Falaise and many others like it had no such luck. There, the arguments were not about cats and safe passage but about blood and retribution. Let's leave the ghost of Bartholomew Chassany and his victorious, albeit ungrateful, rats. Let's drift away from the intellectual games of the ecclesiastical court and return to the muddy town square we started in. The air here is heavier. There are no witty procedural arguments, no clever appeals to scripture, no demands to lock up the local cats. Here in the secular court, there is only the grim, unblinking finality of the sentence. And the punishment is not a curse, but a rope. When an individual animal like the pig of Falaise was found guilty of a capital crime, its punishment was designed to mirror the punishment of a human of similar social standing. For the lower classes in medieval and early modern Europe, the sentence for murder or treason was death by hanging. And so it was for the pig. This is the central, stark fact of secular animal justice. The most common punishment was execution, carried out with all the solemn public ritual afforded to a human criminal. The goal was to make the punishment as human-like as possible, to drive home the point that a human-like crime had been committed. The execution itself was a deeply symbolic public spectacle. After the verdict, the condemned animal would be led from the jail to the town gallows. And here's a detail that truly blurs the line between tragedy and farce. The animal was sometimes dressed in human clothing for its final journey. There are records of pigs being fitted with a jacket and breeches, their front legs tied through the sleeves. This wasn't done to be funny. It was part of the ritual, a way of reinforcing the animal's anthropomorphic guilt. By clothing the pig as a man, they were visually transforming it into the murderer it had been convicted of being. The town's public executioner would be paid his standard fee for the service. One can only imagine his weary sigh at being told he had to hang a pig, and yes, it would be wearing a waistcoat, and no, he couldn't just get it over with. There was a protocol to be followed. If the crime had suggestions of the unnatural or heretical, the punishment might be even more severe. Burning at the stake, a punishment reserved for the worst human heretics and sorcerers, was sometimes used for animals accused of similarly dark crimes. A physical body had committed a physical crime, and a physical punishment was required to purge the sin and restore order. The justice was brutal, tangible, and absolute. Now, contrast this with the sentence handed down by the church courts Chassany so deftly manipulated. There, the punishment wasn't for the body, but for the soul, or rather, for the spiritual space the creatures occupied. The anathema, the curse of excommunication, was a spiritual death sentence. It was a declaration that the pests were officially cut off from God's grace. They were damned, cast out into a spiritual wilderness where, theoretically, they would wither and perish, no longer under divine protection. But because it was a legal proceeding, there were still opportunities for bizarre, last-minute negotiations. This is my favorite quirky tidbit from the ecclesiastical courts. Sometimes a clever defense lawyer could negotiate a kind of settlement. In a famous, long-running case against weevils in the French village of Saint-Julien, the citizens, weary of the plague, actually offered the weevils a compromise. They would cede a plot of land outside the village for the weevils' exclusive use in perpetuity if the insects would just agree to leave their vineyards alone. The weevils' court-appointed lawyer considered the offer, but then rejected the first plot of land offered, arguing to the court that it was barren and the soil was of poor quality, entirely unsuitable for his client's needs. You just have to appreciate the image of a lawyer, acting on behalf of insects, turning up his nose at a real estate offer. No, this simply won't do. The drainage is terrible, there's no morning sun. My clients require a habitat with more amenities. Historians and theologians debate whether these two forms of punishment stem from different theories of animal consciousness. The secular court seemed to assume the animal possessed an individual, culpable will, a flicker of reason that made it responsible for its actions. Its body was the source of the crime, so its body must be destroyed. The ecclesiastical court, on the other hand, treated the pests as a mindless, collective force of nature, an instrument of a higher power, be it God's anger or Satan's mischief. You can't reason with a hurricane, but you can pray for it to stop. The church's curse was a legalistic form of prayer, an appeal to the spiritual realm to solve a physical problem. Of course, the effectiveness of each punishment varied. The hangman's noose was undeniably final. The pig of Falaise did not reoffend. The success rate of the anathema, however, was inconsistent. But the church had a brilliant excuse built into the system. If the curse was pronounced and the locusts were still munching on the barley a week later, it was never the fault of the curse. It was the fault of the people. The bishop would simply announce that their repentance had been insufficient. "I did my part," you can hear him saying. "Clearly, some of you are still harboring sinful thoughts. I'm looking at you, Jacques. I heard you skipped Vespers on Tuesday. Don't come crying to me until you've all purified your souls." So you have these two parallel systems of justice, one ending in a public execution, the other in a public prayer. Both are taken with the utmost seriousness, which raises the most important question of all. Why? Why go to all this trouble? Why not just kill the pig quietly or put down poison for the rats? Why create these elaborate, expensive, and time-consuming legal spectacles? The question hangs in the night air, more persistent than any ghost from these long-forgotten trials. Why? Why the lawyers, the meticulously recorded proceedings, the solemn processions, and the public pronouncements, all for creatures that could not understand a single word of it? Was it all just some collective madness, a historical curiosity we can comfortably smile at from our modern vantage point? The answer is far more profound, and it tells us less about the animals and more about the desperate human need for order in a world that perpetually felt on the brink of chaos. Life in medieval and early modern Europe was fragile, uncertain, and terrifyingly random. You could lose your child to a fever, your home to a fire, or your entire year's harvest to a swarm of insects that appeared overnight. Famine, plague, and violence were not abstract concepts. They were neighbors. In the face of this overwhelming uncertainty, people clung to the systems that gave them a sense of control. And the most powerful system they had for imposing a human narrative onto a chaotic event was the law. The trial of an animal was a powerful refusal to accept that tragedy could be random. It was a way of taking a horrifying, senseless act, a pig killing a baby, and forcing it into a story with a beginning, a middle, and a just end. It transformed chaos into a problem with a solution. At its heart, the animal trial was an act of communal catharsis. This is the mainstream historical view. These trials were about restoring the peace of the community. A crime, whether committed by man or beast, didn't just harm the immediate victim, it tore a hole in the social and spiritual fabric of the town. It introduced fear and disorder. A public trial, followed by a public punishment, was a ritual designed to mend that tear. It was a powerful collective statement that said, "This is our town. These are our rules. We have faced this evil, we have judged it, and we have purged it." It was the ultimate form of thoughts and prayers, but with a lot more paperwork and a much grimmer conclusion for the defendant. This all makes more sense when you remember their deeply anthropocentric worldview. For them, nature wasn't a neutral, indifferent force governed by biology. The entire universe was a grand drama centered on humanity's relationship with God. Every event had meaning. A good harvest was a sign of God's favor. A drought was a sign of his displeasure. An animal that stepped out of its divinely appointed role, a dog should be a companion, a cow should give milk, a pig should become bacon, was a terrifying perversion of the natural order. It might be a tool of Satan, a vessel for a demon, or simply a glitch in God's creation. Whatever the cause, the anomaly had to be addressed through the human system of justice, which was itself seen as a pale reflection of God's perfect justice. Sociologists and historians still debate the primary function of these trials. Were they aimed more at God or at the people? One school of thought maintains they were primarily supernatural acts. The curse on the locusts was a genuine attempt to appeal to God to intervene. The execution of the pig was a way of cleansing the land of a demonic or sinful presence. Another school argues the trials were almost entirely social theater. They were for human consumption, designed to reinforce the power of the local lord or bishop, to calm public anxiety, and to provide a convenient scapegoat for misfortune. It's much easier to blame a swarm of beetles for a ruined crop than to confront the terrifying possibility that sometimes harvests just fail. The beetles, after all, can't argue back. Well, unless Bartholomew Chassany is their lawyer, the animal often became the literal embodiment of a scapegoat. This taps into a very ancient and quirky psychological need. by projecting the community's fears or sins onto the animal and then ritually punishing or expelling it, the community felt cleansed. The pig wasn't just a pig, it was the embodiment of the chaos that had shattered their peace. The locusts weren't just insects, they were the physical manifestation of the community's sins. By trying and condemning them, the people were symbolically reaffirming their own righteousness and control. And for the authorities, it was a fantastic piece of public relations. What better way to prove your worth as a ruler than to show you can bring the full force of the law down on anyone who disturbs the peace, even if they have 4 legs or 1,000? It's a pretty good campaign slogan for your local feudal lord. I may not be able to lower your taxes, but I can and will take a caterpillar to court. So no, it wasn't just madness. It was a desperate, elaborate, and deeply human attempt to build a seawall of logic and ritual against an ocean of chaos. It was a way of making sense of the senseless. And while pigs, rats, and insects were the most common defendants to be caught in this legal net, the system was so all-encompassing that, on occasion, it managed to ensnare some even more surprising culprits. Just when you think this journey can't possibly get any stranger, you discover that the legal net cast by these medieval and early modern courts was wider and more imaginative than you could have guessed. We've met the pigs and the rats, the weevils and the caterpillars. They were the usual suspects, the common criminals of the animal world. But the long arm of the law didn't stop at the farmyard fence. It reached into the sky, into the water, and into the very heart of folklore itself. Let's travel to the city of Basel, Switzerland, in the year 1474. The defendant in this particular case is a rooster. Its crime? The heinous and profoundly unnatural act of laying an egg. Now, to our modern minds, this sounds like a biological absurdity, something to be reported in a scientific journal, not a courtroom. But to the people of 15th century Basel, this was no laughing matter. This was an act of pure evil. An egg laid by a rooster was known in folklore as a cockatrice egg, a magical object of immense dark power. Legend held that if such an egg were to be hatched, preferably by a toad sitting on a dung heap, it would bring forth a basilisk, a terrifying serpent-like monster whose gaze, or even breath, could kill a person instantly. So. This was not a trial about a confused chicken. It was a trial about witchcraft, demonic influence, and a conspiracy to unleash a supernatural weapon of mass destruction upon the city. The rooster was accused of being in league with the devil. A lawyer was duly appointed to defend it, but the evidence, namely, the egg itself, was rather damning. The rooster's lawyer must have had an impossible job. It's one thing to argue reasonable doubt, but it's another thing when the smoking gun is a literal egg presented to the court. The rooster was found guilty, and the punishment for this diabolical crime could only be one thing: death by fire. The rooster was publicly burned at the stake, just like a human heretic, and its unnatural egg was burned along with it, saving the city of Basel from the terrifying prospect of a basilisk invasion. The law's reach didn't stop at the shoreline either. In the port city of Marseilles, France, a lawsuit was once brought against a pod of dolphins. The historical record is a little hazy on the specifics of their crime, but they were likely accused of damaging fishermen's nets or driving away the fish, thereby threatening the city's food supply and economy. One can only imagine the utter bewilderment of the court officials sent to the harbor to read out the formal summons to the waves, hoping the defendants were listening. Similarly, ecclesiastical courts around Lake Geneva in Switzerland entertain cases against the local eels for likewise troubling the fishermen. This impulse to legally address the agent of misfortune, whatever it may be, occasionally spilled over from the animal kingdom into the world of inanimate objects. Historians debate the extent to which objects were formally tried, but a related legal concept from English common law, known as the deodand, shows the same underlying philosophy. The term comes from the Latin deodandum, meaning to be given to God. A deodand was any object, animal, or instrument that had caused a human's death. If a man was run over by a cart, the cart was the deodand. If he was gored by an ox, the ox was the deodand. If a church bell fell on someone's head, the bell was the deodand. The object was declared forfeit to the crown, seized by the king's coroner, and its value was then supposed to be used for pious or charitable purposes, to pay for masses for the victim's soul, for example. It wasn't a trial, but it was a formal legal recognition that the object itself was tainted by the death and had to be ritually dealt with. It's a system with certain advantages. Your new self-driving cart runs over the neighbor? It's the cart's fault. The cart gets arrested and given to God, and you just have to get a new one. This legal net could also be cast over the smallest of creatures. In one of the most wonderfully specific cases on record, the Bishop of Lausanne, Switzerland, brought a suit against the local leeches. They were formally admonished for being a nuisance, for making the local bathing and drinking spots unpleasant, and for their generally bloodthirsty and unchristian behavior. They were given the standard series of warnings, and when they failed to repent and depart, they were formally excommunicated. The leeches, after being officially damned and cast out from God's grace, were presumably devastated and vowed to turn their lives around. Or more likely, they carried on being slimy and hungry, entirely unaware of their sudden fall from theological grace. From roosters laying basilisk eggs to excommunicated leeches, these cases show a worldview so different from our own. It was a world where the lines between the natural and supernatural, between law and magic, were not just blurry but practically non-existent. But this world, with all its peculiar certainties, could not last forever. New ideas were stirring in Europe. A new age was dawning that would bring with it a new way of seeing the universe, one that had far less room for talking to insects and putting dolphins on trial. The world of the basilisk-laying rooster and the dolphin defendant could not last forever. You can feel a slow but profound shift in the intellectual air of Europe. The cool, damp, mystical twilight of the medieval era is gradually giving way to a brighter, harsher, and more analytical light. A new age is dawning, an age that will come to be called the Enlightenment, and it has little time for the solemn absurdities of the past. Beginning in the 17th century and flowering in the 18th, a revolution in thought swept across the continent. Philosophers and scientists began to champion reason, logic, and empirical evidence over superstition, tradition, and divine revelation. Thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, and Isaac Newton were building a new model of the universe, not as a great mysterious moral stage play directed by God, but as a vast, intricate, and ultimately knowable machine, governed by predictable physical laws. And this new way of thinking would prove to be a death sentence for the animal trial. The fatal blow came from one of the most influential minds of the age, the French philosopher René Descartes. He put forth a radical and immensely influential idea. Animals, he argued, were nothing more than complex biological machines or automata. They were intricate arrangements of flesh and bone, sinew and nerve, but they were utterly without a soul, without consciousness, and without the capacity for reason. The sounds they made, a dog's whimper, a pig's squeal, were not expressions of pain or fear in the human sense. They were merely the mechanical noises of the machine in operation, like the creaking of a wheel or the chiming of a clock. It's a harsh and uncomfortable philosophy to our modern ears, but its effect on the intellectual framework of animal trials was absolute. If an animal is just a machine, it cannot be a moral agent. It cannot form intent. It cannot, therefore, commit a crime. A clock that runs too fast isn't evil. It's broken. A dog that bites isn't a felon. It's malfunctioning. You don't put a faulty machine on trial. You don't hire a lawyer for a broken clock. You simply fix it or you get rid of it. Descartes' philosophy yanked the very foundation out from under the entire legal edifice that had stood for 500 years. It's hard to find a pig guilty of capital murder when the most celebrated philosopher of the era is arguing that it has less self-awareness than your grandfather's cuckoo clock. It really sucks the righteous fury out of the prosecution's argument. This new mechanistic worldview began to filter down into society. Naturalists started explaining plagues of locusts not as a divine curse, but as a biological event, triggered by weather patterns and breeding cycles. The law, in turn, began to place ever more emphasis on the concept of mens rea, or guilty mind, as an essential component of any crime. Since an animal had no mind, it could not be guilty. The blame and legal responsibility began to shift from the animal itself to its human owner. The farmer whose ox gored a man was now held liable, not the ox. The owner was responsible for controlling their property. The decline was slow and uneven. The practice didn't just vanish overnight. It just became increasingly old-fashioned and, eventually, faintly ridiculous. It faded away first in the major cities and intellectual centers, but it clung on for decades longer in more isolated, rural communities where the old ways died hard. One of the last widely recorded formal executions of an animal in France occurred in 1740, when a cow was put to death. A case involving a dog in Switzerland in 1906 is often cited as the very last gasp of the tradition. The practice became like wearing a powdered wig to a symphony. For a long time it was normal, then for a while it was still seen in certain traditionalist circles, and then one day people just realized it looked silly. Historians debate the primary driver of this decline. Was it a top-down change pushed by elite philosophers like Descartes and the legal reformers who adopted their ideas? Or was it a more bottom-up phenomenon, as literacy and education spread, and ordinary people developed a more practical and less superstitious view of the world around them? The truth, as always, is likely a complex interplay of the two. The new philosophies provided the intellectual justification for abandoning a practice that many people were probably already beginning to question. While the dawning of the Age of Reason was undoubtedly a leap forward for human thought, you can't help but feel that something was also lost. The enchanted world, where every animal and every event was part of a great cosmic story, was replaced by a colder, more impersonal universe of matter in motion. The change was necessary, it was progress, but it left a little less room for mystery. On the plus side, the legal profession took a hit. The once lucrative and exciting field of insect litigation completely dried up, forcing thousands of lawyers to fall back on the dreary business of suing other humans. And so the strange chapter of European animal trials drew to a close. But the underlying human impulse, to see ourselves in the animal kingdom, to project our morals and our laws onto them, and to judge them by our own standards, didn't vanish entirely. And the idea of holding animals legally accountable was not, as it turns out, a uniquely European invention. You might be tempted to think this whole bizarre legal enterprise was a uniquely European eccentricity, a strange, prolonged fever dream born from a mixture of medieval theology and a deep-seated love of paperwork. But the human impulse to hold the natural world to our own moral standards, to judge and punish it when it steps out of line, is a surprisingly global and ancient phenomenon. The French may have perfected the bureaucracy of it, but they certainly didn't invent the basic idea. Let's drift much further back in time, to the sun-baked stones of ancient Athens, more than 1,000 years before the pig of Falaise met its end. Here, in the cradle of democracy and philosophy, there was a special court called the Prytaneum. Its main purpose was to handle homicides where the perpetrator was unknown. But it had another, stranger jurisdiction. It also presided over deaths caused by animals or even by inanimate objects. If an ox gored a man to death, a trial was held for the ox. If a statue toppled from its pedestal and crushed an unfortunate citizen, the statue itself was put on trial. The punishment, if found guilty, was always the same: exile. The offending object or animal was formally taken to the border and cast out of Athenian territory, never to return. This wasn't about retribution in the same way as the gallows, it was about ritual purification. The agent of death was tainted with a spiritual pollution, a miasma, that had to be physically expelled to restore balance to the city. It's a comfort to know that if you were ever flattened by a falling column in ancient Athens, your family could rest easy, assured that the column had been brought to justice and would never trouble anyone again. At least, not within city limits. The roots go even deeper in the ancient world. In the Avesta, the holy scriptures of Zoroastrianism in ancient Persia, there are specific laws detailing punishments for dogs that exhibit aggressive behavior, with escalating penalties for repeat offenses, a kind of prodo, 3 strikes. Law for canines. And of course, there is the famous and hugely influential passage in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Exodus explicitly states, "If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten." This single line provided a direct, divine precedent for animal capital punishment that would echo through European legal thought for the next 2 millennia. Anthropologists and historians debate whether these parallel practices in different cultures stem from a single, ancient root of human psychology, or if they simply developed independently as similar societies grappled with similar problems. Is there a universal human need to perform a ritual against the agent of death, whatever it may be? The evidence is scattered but suggestive. There are folkloric accounts from pre-colonial West Africa of rituals resembling trials for animals that had killed humans, often involving a shaman or diviner who would be consulted to determine the animal's spiritual motivation. In parts of Southeast Asia, a tiger that had killed a villager was sometimes hunted, and its body subjected to a post-mortem ceremony with a judicial character, where village elders would formally admonish the dead creature for its crimes. Getting a stern lecture from the elders after you're already dead seems a bit like adding insult to injury, but one imagines it was very cathartic for the community. Even as the formal legal trials died out, the primal impulse never completely vanished. As late as 1916, in the American state of Tennessee, an elephant named Mary, who had killed her handler, was publicly hanged from an industrial crane in front of a crowd of thousands. There was no formal trial, no Bartholomew Chassany to argue her case. But the public demand for justice, the spectacle of a public execution to satisfy communal outrage, the echoes of Falaise are unmistakable. What seems to set the European model, especially in France and Switzerland? Apart from these other examples is its sheer, obsessive legalism. The deep dive into procedure, the appointment of lawyers, the filing of appeals, the decades-long lawsuits over weevils negotiating for better land, that seems to be a special flavor of absurdity. Most cultures were content to simply identify the culprit and perform the ritual punishment. It seems only the French decided that the animal must first be properly served a subpoena, be represented by competent counsel, and have the right to appeal the verdict to a higher court. It displays a certain admirable if baffling commitment to the bit.so. This strange habit was not confined to one continent or one religion. It was a recurring theme, a strange melody that has played in different keys all over the world and throughout history. And as you drift back from this brief world tour, back to the quiet of your own time and your own room, you are left to ponder the final legacy of these strange echoes from our collective past. And so here we are, back in the quiet of the 21st century, where the only trial a pet is likely to face is a judgment passed on social media for stealing a sandwich from the kitchen counter. The world of animal executions and ecclesiastical lawsuits feels impossibly distant, a half-remembered dream from a foggy and unenlightened past. But the echoes of that world, faint as they are still with us. The great legacy of these trials is that they serve as a powerful reminder of how fluid and culturally specific our concepts of justice, consciousness, and innocence truly are. For centuries, it was considered perfectly logical and just to provide a pig with a lawyer and then hang it from a gibbet. Today, the idea is the very definition of absurdity. It forces us to ask what certainties we hold today that will seem just as bizarre to our descendants 500 years from now. We no longer put animals on trial, but we haven't stopped litigating their actions. We have simply changed the language and the procedure. Think of the complex web of dangerous dog laws that exist in many countries. When a dog bites someone, it can be seized, evaluated by experts, and, through a court or administrative order, be condemned to death. We've replaced the spectacle of the hangman in the town square with the quiet, sterile procedure of a veterinarian's injection, but the end result for the offending animal is remarkably similar. The main difference is we don't make it wear a tiny pair of trousers. The deep human impulse to anthropomorphize, to project our own moral and emotional landscapes onto the creatures around us, is as strong as ever. We speak of our pets feeling guilty when they chew a shoe, of cats acting out of spite, of animals performing heroic deeds. And in a wonderfully weird modern parallel, we have the internet phenomenon of animal shaming. People post photos of their pets with handwritten signs detailing their crimes. I ate an entire stick of butter, or I unspool all the toilet paper. It's a joke, of course, but it comes from that same ancient place. The desire to hold an animal to a human standard of behavior and to publicly declare its transgression. and the central question that Bartholomew Chassany so brilliantly exploited. What is the true legal and moral status of an animal is still being furiously debated today. Philosophers and animal rights advocates argue over the concept of animal personhood. Should a chimpanzee have legal rights? Should a corporation have more rights than a whale? These modern arguments are the direct intellectual descendants of the debates that took place in that autumn courtroom. We are still, in our own way, trying to figure out where humanity ends and the rest of the natural world begins. Perhaps the greatest value in looking back at these strange proceedings is not what they teach us about animals, but what they teach us about ourselves. They are a funhouse mirror reflecting our own beliefs about justice in distorted, exaggerated ways. They show us that our own systems are not absolute, but are products of our time. Maybe future generations will look back at our society and be baffled. They held formal legal proceedings over parking violations, they might ask. They issued a summons for a metal box that stayed in one place too long? How strange. Our journey through this peculiar chapter of history is at its end. We have seen a pig in a waistcoat, a rooster accused of consorting with the devil, and a lawyer who bravely defended the rights of rats. It was a world where the law was considered so powerful, so sacred, and so essential that it had to be applied to everyone and everything, even if you had fur, feathers, or 1,000 tiny, unrepentant legs. There is, if you listen closely, a strange kind of beautiful, all-encompassing logic in that. The courts are adjourned now. The voices of the past, the earnest lawyers and the angry bishops, the sorrowful plaintiffs and the silent, furry defendants, all of them are growing quiet. The dust of centuries has settled in the empty courtroom of fillets. All the old arguments have faded, the ink on the parchment has grown faint, and all of the passion and fury has long since dissipated into the gentle, quiet flow of time. All that is left is the story itself, a soft and distant echo. And you can let that echo fade now too. Let the images dissolve. Let the thoughts drift away like clouds on a slow, lazy afternoon. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing more to learn. The journey is over, and all that remains is the soft, peaceful darkness, the gentle weight of your blankets, and the easy, rhythmic breath of deep and untroubled sleep. There is only rest now. Just let your mind be still and allow yourself to drift away.